some time ago I went to a conference that Elle Formby organised, who's here today, and at that conference somebody was speaking about domestic abuse and violence amongst LGBT plus communities, and I thought, when we set up this project, I really want to get this person on board. And I'm really grateful that she's been really supportive and is prepared to speak today. So can you put your hands together for one of the most eminent speakers, I think, on this issue? No pressure here, Catherine, at all. Put your hands together for Catherine Donovan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What an introduction. I'm really, really delighted to be here, because I think this is the work that absolutely needs to be done, which is development work with LGBT people themselves around what domestic violence and abuse might look like, what might feel like, and to kind of challenge some of the myths around who is affected by domestic violence and abuse and what can be done about it, as well as obviously working with practitioners to make sure that when people do come forward that they get an appropriate and positive and respectful service. So I just want to say very quickly about the terms that I'm going to use. So I say LGB and/or T people to recognise that trans people don't necessarily identify as gay, bisexual or lesbian. I sometimes refer to intimate partner abuse rather than domestic violence and abuse, and that's because I agree with the work of lots of people that there are different kinds of violence and abusive behaviours, and that it is really important that we become smart about recognising these and identifying them so that people get the best service that they can to respond to their needs. So intimate partner violence and abuse really is anything that might happen in a relationship, whereas domestic violence and abuse is what we are probably most interested in, which I use the Home Office definition that it's a pattern of behaviours, physical, sexual, emotional, financial and coercive control. So in domestic violence and abuse, this is one partner in a relationship exerting power and control over their other partner. So I'm going to talk about the problem of domestic violence and abuse in the relationships of LGBT and/or T people, and then look at some of the problems that face victim survivors who are LGBT and/or T when they're seeking help, most of whom we know don't seek help, but that's what we're trying to kind of think about how we can change that. There's a public story about domestic violence and abuse that I want to talk about. There's an assumption, because of that public story, that when violence and abuse happens in same-sex relationships, that this might be mutual abuse, or it's more likely to be mutual abuse. So I want to talk about that. And then I also want to talk a little bit about how victims get constructed and how that might also get in the way of recognising your victimisation. And I'm going to use a case study, and I mean, obviously I haven't got masses of time, so I've chosen a case study that I think provides lots of different bits of learning about how people make sense of what's happening to them in a relationship. But because it's one case study, it won't involve all members of LGBT and/or T possible relationships. So I apologise for that, but there are lots of similarities in experience as well as some differences, and I'll try and refer to those as they come along. And finally, I'll just kind of talk about some of the things that we think might be usefully done to start addressing this, what we're up against. So heterosexual cisgender women are clearly the largest group who experience and report intimate partner violence. That's clear. I'm not here to negate that or criticise that. However, proportionately, LGB women, we haven't got the same data on men in Britain yet, are more likely to report what's called partner abuse or sexual violence than heterosexual cisgender women are. So if you look at the crime survey of England and Wales, the Office for National Statistics have done an analysis last year showing that bisexual women are twice as likely to report partner abuse, and that lesbian and gay women also more likely to report partner abuse than heterosexual women. Bisexual women 5 times more likely to report sexual assault than heterosexual women, and lesbian and gay women also more likely to report sexual assault than heterosexual women. So something is going on And it is really concerning that we don't seem to get the same kind of recognition for these groups as we do for heterosexual women. And there are lots of reasons for that, but I think this is concerning. So I've also had a look at the police in Greater Manchester. They're one of the only police forces that now are able to identify a relationship when domestic violence is reported. So like in Northumbria and most other police forces, which is where I'm based, they can identify domestic violence as happening between two women or two men, but the two women might be mother and daughter, or they might be sisters. So Manchester is the only force that has been publicly proud that they are able to record sexuality of the relationship that is being reported around domestic violence. So they had, in the first year that they did this, 775 cases reported to the police. So in a population in Greater Manchester of nearly 2,800,000, and if you guesstimate that about 7% of them should be LGB under T, which is what the government suggests you should do, we've got a reporting rate amongst that population of 0.4%. So clearly disproportionately low. And we need to be doing something about that. And as Alison was saying, the MARAC referrals are also disproportionately low. So why might this be? So the work that I did with Marianne Hester, we argue that there is a public story about domestic violence and abuse. And feminism has been really successful in transforming, as Alan was saying, what used to be called just a domestic incident, transforming that from being an individual's problem to a public problem, a serious public problem, very successfully through activism and scholarship. But there's been unintended consequences of that, because what we're left with is a public story that says this is a problem of heterosexual men for heterosexual women. It's a problem of physical violence, and it's a problem of a particular presentation of gender. So big, strong, embodied man being physically violent towards a small, weak, embodied woman. And that is really problematic, because if you don't see yourself in that story, if you can't identify yourself in that story, it becomes much harder to tell your story. Not only to tell it, but for people to hear it, because they also don't see you in that story. So they struggle to try and work out how to make sense of what you might be telling them. And there are myths that then arise from this story, that domestic violence and abuse between women or men, or any violence and abuse, is not going to be as harmful. It's not going to be as risky, because women can't be violent. So anything that they do is more like a cat fight, or not to be worried about. Violence between men can't be victimised. Violence between men is probably a result of because they're competitive. Men are aggressive anyway. They're used to it. So it's not going to be as serious or as risky. So then violence between women and men starts to morph into that it must be mutual abuse, because there's somehow assumed to be equality, that they're the same. Two women together are the same, and two men together are the same, and that means that it might be mutual. And practitioners have often said to me that that's one of the areas of this work that they find the most challenging, in terms of their confidence about how can they be sure who the perpetrator is and who the victim is when you've got two women together or two men together. So that tells us something about the strength of that public story, because if a heterosexual couple isn't involved, we start to think, well, who is the perpetrator? Who is the man in the relationship? Who is the victim? Who is the woman in the relationship? And that's because the power imbalance is assumed to be heteronormative. That this is that we can assume the direction of power by gender, or the presentation of gender. And therefore, if you've got two women or two men, then the power is the same. There's no imbalance of power. And then we've got another problem, which is about how victims are constructed. So Christie wrote one of the big seminal papers around the ideal victim. Who's the ideal victim? And he says the ideal victim is an old woman who gets mugged on her way back from shopping. And she's the ideal victim because she is blameless. She's not anywhere she shouldn't be. She's not doing anything that she shouldn't do. She's wearing the appropriate clothing, and she's just going about her everyday business. So she's blameless, and she's defenseless. She can't defend herself against the ideal perpetrator, who obviously in this binary is going to be stronger, more powerful, and also evil in some way to want to mug an old woman. And the victim also then becomes feminized. And we see that in the responses of the men who say they don't want to admit that they've been victimized in their intimate relationships because somehow that makes them weak. This is the ideal victim that we're talking about. So it constructs a particular way of thinking about who can be victimized and who can be perpetrators. And again, that doesn't just affect practitioners, ourselves, it affects people who are victimized. Because you start to believe that if you're a victim, you don't fight back. Victims are blameless and defenseless. They don't fight back, they don't retaliate, they don't get angry, they don't provoke. They are always and ever passive or weak and can be overpowered by the person who would do them harm. That's also problematic, obviously. And then looking at what feminist scholarship does give us, I think the idea of power, following the power in a relationship is really, really important to understand who is being victimized, what kind of violence is being used in the relationship. And many people have told us from the research that they do that victimized partners people who are victimized in domestic violence and abuse are not without agency. They do fight back in lots of different ways, not necessarily through using physical violence, though sometimes they do, but in other ways. The fact that they seek help, even if they're seeking help from friends, is an act of agency. They are not passive. They are people who take action. But they also sometimes retaliate and defend themselves, or their children, their property, their friends, their relatives. So many people who are victimized by what we would say as practitioners or outsiders looking in and say that's domestic violence, that's a controlling relationship, the person in it doesn't see it necessarily. So we've got a job of work to do to kind of have those conversations with people about what does it look like, what does it mean to say that you are in an abusive relationship. And of course, most domestic violence and abuse doesn't conform to that other part of the public story that is that it's about an emergency needing to be acted on in the moment, in the incident. Many relationships are quite chronic, ongoing. Stark has said this, that lots of the abusive behaviours that go on in domestically violent relationships are quite low level. They're below the threshold of a crime. That's why we've now got the Coercive Control Act, to try and gather the evidence that this is about patterns of behaviours that might seem to be low level. And especially if you just plucked an incident out, you might think, well, what is the problem there? It's a disagreement, or isn't that typical? Isn't that what people do in their relationships? Like we've just had with old Boris recently. Anyway, we won't get distracted by that. So most of the domestic violence and abuse that people experience is not of the emergency needing to be rescued kind of experiences. It's mostly just hidden in plain sight. And in our work that I did with Marianne, we spoke to people who did not identify as heterosexual, so lesbian, gay, bi, queer, homosexual, gay, however they identified. And we spoke to heterosexual women. And we came to the conclusion that domestically violent relationships can be identified by the rules. There are rules in these relationships, and there are two really, really important rules. One is that the relationship is for the abusive partner. It's on their terms, and they make all the key decisions, whatever they are in that relationship. So they won't necessarily be the same across different relationships, but the key decisions are made by an abusive partner. And the other rule is that the person being victimised is responsible for the behaviour of their abusive partner, for the abusive partner themselves, for their children if they have them, for their household if they share one. And love is really important in understanding domestically violent and abusive relationships, because domestically violent and abusive relationships are not always awful all the time. So love is part of the mix. Feelings of love, feelings of loyalty, feelings of wanting to protect an abusive partner, and abusive partners rely on that. And they often, very often, provide reasons for why they behave the way they do. Many kinds of stories. They were abused as a child, they have drink problems, their boss doesn't understand them. There are as many reasons as there are abusive people, always. And what they're doing there, so on the one hand, they set the rules for the relationship, they're the ones who are in charge. It's quite associated with a particular kind of masculinity. But on the other hand, they're very needy. And they want to be looked after. And they expect care and protection and loyalty from their victimised partner. So on the other hand, when abusive partners show their need and neediness, tell them that nobody will love them like they do, tell them that they'll kill themselves if the victimised partner leaves, that elicits care from the victimised partner. So again, victims don't necessarily feel like they're victims, because what they're doing is managing the relationship. They're actually very actively engaged, emotionally doing a lot of the work in the relationship. So they don't see themselves as passive or victimised. They see themselves as doing quite a lot of work to look after the relationship and look after the abusive partner. So we, the Duluth Power and Control wheel, and I'm sure many of you know this, we changed this because we think that the relationship rules are central to working out how power is operating, and it is about power and control. But physical and sexual violence are just different kinds of tactics that abusive partners can use. So they just become part of the spokes. Practices of love often glue these relationships together, and obligations of care underneath that heading of love. And around the rim are the intersecting identities that people inhabit. So people's faith communities, people's race identities, people's social class, people's age, their disability, their migration status, their citizenship status. All of these intersecting identities are lenses through which they experience the abuse that they're experiencing and make sense of it, and make decisions about how they're going to help seek, and if they do help seek, who they're going to go to. So now I want to, how am I doing for time? Oh, you're kidding me, okay. So now I want to talk about Claire. Here's the case study, just to kind of illustrate some of these points. So Claire's bisexual, cisgender white woman who was in a relationship for 6 years with a lesbian partner. It wasn't okay to identify as bisexual, so there's identity abuse. Identity abuse is really important in the relationships of LGBT and LGBT people. A range of different ways that people experience identity abuse, obviously threats to out them, but also demeaning their identity, that you're not really gay enough, or that if you were a real lesbian, you do whatever it is that the abusive partner wants you to do. But also, like this biphobia here, you're not allowed to identify as biphobia because they don't believe in bisexuality. Claire moved into her partner's house, paid all her contributions in cash. Her partner didn't believe in using banks, and that meant that all the financial decisions became the partner's. So the relationship rules start to be established, who's making key decisions. Her partner also didn't believe in being visible to the authorities, so she wouldn't put Claire officially as a person living in the house. So that meant that they didn't have to pay council tax, but it also meant that Claire couldn't vote. So, which obviously then she found very difficult, that she's being made invisible formally. Her partner also became very jealous of her ex-lovers, friends, colleagues at work. So in the end, Claire stopped seeing people because it wasn't worth it. So she says, in my 6-year relationship, I saw a really scary change in me. I'm a very gentle person, but after the first year, I found myself getting really aggressive. See? She's not sounding like a victim, is she? But after the first year, I found myself getting really aggressive. I sort of went into the relationship wanting to discuss things, but very quickly she got very, very insecure about sort of past, immediate, informal relationships that I was having or had. Things like work dues, one of the past relationships with somebody at work. So any work do I went to, within half an hour, I'd just be receiving texts, blah, 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 blah. I'd go home, and then I'd just stop going out. So I was quite submissive, I guess, in that sense. And that really annoyed me. See? So she's being, all the signs are there. If she arrived at a domestic violence agency and talked through these things, you'd start to be worried. You'd be thinking there's control going on here. But her response, as she sees it, is she got aggressive and she got annoyed. She starts to resist, non-violent resistance. And she tries to redress the increasing imbalance in the relationship. Emma, the abusive partner, obviously all the names have changed, presented as butch in her manner and dress. Claire felt pressured to present as more feminine, which she observed meant that that would make her even more submissive. And many of Emma's friends presented in butch femme couples, so Claire felt pressure to match the behaviours. But Claire says, listen to the resistance. It kind of had the opposite effect on me, because you've got this control situation going on. I felt that becoming more femme was being submissive. You're kind of buying into this, okay, Henny, yeah, I'll let you pay for that. I'll just keep quiet over here. You go and talk about bikes. I'll make the tea. I didn't want to do that. Blah, 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 blah. So I started to change the way I was dressing. So she actually changed the way that she was dressing to be more butch, actually. In this kind of small town with this group of lesbians, God never declare you bisexual. Do you know what I mean? Keep that one to yourself. So feel part of it, I felt I needed to butch up rather than a femme up. So she's resisting. This is not a person who sees herself as being victimised. Do you think you experienced domestic abuse? No. She does see that the relationship was controlling, but she doesn't see it as domestic violence and abuse. So she doesn't fit the public story because she's not heterosexual, and she doesn't fit the ideal victim. She sees herself as being agentic. She sees herself as being angry, resentful of what's happening. Rather than being the gentle person she was, she finds herself responding to her partner by, she says, getting on the ladder of escalation, shouting matches. I'm not going to go through these things now because we are running out of time. So I'll just jump on to the impacts, because that's the other way to really get an understanding of what is happening in a relationship, is to see what the impact is on somebody of living in this kind of relationship. So she says, I think that relationship taught me the possibility of the way, if you allow it, so victim blaming, it's her responsibility, if you allow it, somebody else can really kind of drag you down, whether it's emotionally, physically. My weight went up. I think it went to about 18 stone at one point. Completely lost my self-respect. I remember looking in the mirror. This would have been about 4.5, 5 years into the relationship, and not recognising who was looking back at me. Like I say, my hair was shorter. I'd gained 4 stone. I was dressing in clothes that I'd never dreamt of dressing in. This is loss of self. This is diminishing of somebody's self-esteem, somebody's self-confidence. So Emma is controlling, abusive, prepared to use violence, which I haven't gone into, but there's escalation there, and uses jealousy, really common. This links back to the love thing. If you love me, how could you possibly go out? How could you possibly speak to anybody? Jealousy is something that we all have to think about, because it's something that is culturally very acceptable to explain why people behave badly. And we're all implicated in that, I think. So recognition of DVA, domestic violence and abuse, can be prevented by changing the public story of domestic violence and abuse to be more inclusive, but also changing the story of what a victim or a perpetrator looks like. Specialist domestic violence agencies or mainstream agencies are not seen as potential sources of help for LGB and/or T people. All of the research confirms this. police are not identified unless there is recent escalation in fear or escalation in the violence being experienced, and then people do go, or other people ring because they've heard stuff. Counsellors and therapists are the places that people go after friends. That's what the research tells us, not just in this country, but in other places around the world. And that's really interesting, I think, for domestic violence organisations and LGBT organisations to reach out to counsellors and therapists, because we don't actually know what's going on in those therapeutic relationships and whether they have identified violence and abuse as being, or control, coercive control, as being the problem in the relationship. So we don't know whether they safety plan, we don't know whether they risk assess. So encouraging help seeking within LGB and T networks, communities, friendship groups, we have to have these conversations about what does domestic violence and abuse look like. Use the COSAR wheel to start conversations about what it looks like, what are the different kinds of behaviours that people can experience, including identity abuse, recognising the power dynamics, and then understanding and addressing their fears about reporting. And the list of some of the fears that we've found in the research are there, having their sexuality or gender identity problematised, so that's the issue. Fears about confidentiality, who's going to know, am I going to be outed in this process if I enter this process? Being respected, not experiencing homo, bi, transphobia, not being incorrectly identified as the perpetrator. So being able to trust that the right questions will be asked that will allow you to tell the story of the relationship rather than what happened in this incident. And then how to provide inclusive services, having trained, confident practitioners who can see past the public story of domestic violence and abuse and focus on power and whether and how it's operating in the relationship as a whole. Understand the particular ways identity abuse can be used to control LGBT and T people, and using the COSAR wheel as a way of having discussions to identify the range of behaviours. That's it. Sorry, whistle stop. Oh, more. Sorry. Being explicit. If you don't say to people who are LGBT and T, you specifically are welcome in this service, what will happen is they just assume you're for straight people, because that's their experience of being in the world. So you have to be absolutely explicit. But if you're going to be explicit, you have to be sure that you can deliver. So feeling that you do have training, that you have support, and I would suggest that you reach out to LGBT services and get partnerships with them, either local ones or national now, like Gallup. Yasna's going to speak very soon. They're waiting to support, to make sure that services can be provided in the best way possible for LGBT and T people who experience domestic violence and abuse. Thank you.